If you're an American in the 1800s living in the western half coast today of the United States, where do you think you would find the largest freshwater lake? Some of you might immediately think of uh, Lake Tahoe. Perhaps you had a family vacation there in the past. Others might think of Lake Powell or Lake Mead, not fully understanding that those two lakes were actually man-made creations from the most recent century. The largest freshwater lake at that time would have actually been one that you can't find on the map today, and that's Tulare Lake of California's Central Valley. About 3 years ago, I was reading some articles on flooding that was occurring in the region at the time when I stumbled across a caption titled "The Rebirth of Tulare Lake." I didn't fully understand what Tulare Lake was at that time, so I started doing some pretty extensive research into the lake, the history behind it, and what I would come to find out is one of the most productive agricultural regions of the country today. Despite its relative obscurity today, Tulare Lake was once an expansive lake which was drained to serve a modern purpose. Yet it's one that demands a continued presence in the world today. My main points of discussion today are going to be the history of Tulare Lake prior to colonization, the draining and subsequent cycles of flooding which have occurred in the region, as well as potential future revitalization efforts for Tulare Lake. Let's move on to my first point of discussion. That's going to be the history of Tulare Lake prior to colonization. My first point of discussion today is the history of Tulare Lake prior to colonization. In a 2023 article titled The Return of Piashi, Colonial Unknowing in California's Tulare Lake, published in a fall 2023 issue of Open Rivers, Rethinking Water, Place, and Community, Vivian Underhill, a postdoctoral researcher with the Colorado School of Mines, wrote, "This is Piashi, which means big water in the Yokuts language. A lake so expansive that it stretched to the horizon like an ocean. Piashi once stretched up to 100 miles long and up to 30 miles wide." Piashi, or Tulare Lake, was a difficult lake to measure for its size. It was a relatively shallow body of water, so it could change greatly based on the water coming into it on a daily. That region only receives about 4 inches of precipitation each year, so it's dependent on the snow melt coming off of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The Yokuts in the region are estimated to have had about 19,000 people, or all the way up to over 100,000 people, depending on sources that you look at. In addition to the Yokuts, the lake supported vast ecosystems of fish, birds, elk, as well as plant life. Now that we've discussed the history of Tulare Lake prior to colonization, let's move on to the draining and subsequent refloodings which have occurred with the lake. The draining of Tulare Lake began as far back as the late 18th century with the arrival of the first European missionaries. It would be accelerated with the California Gold Rush, which started in 1848, but it remained mostly unorganized up until about 1862. In a 2019 article titled "The Conversion of a Wetland into an Agricultural Area," California and Mexican historian Emmanuel Perez Tisserand with the University of Toulouse wrote, a particularly severe flood in 1862, which transformed the Central Valley into a vast lake, reignited the debate of the responsibility of draining and damming. The 1862 flood caused Tulare Lake to swell up to about 5,500 square miles. Subsequently, this brought on the demand for organized efforts for draining the lake, and by 1898, the lake was completely dry. The draining of the lake actually caused a type of feedback loop, as with more draining, more land became exposed. As more land, or when more land was exposed, it was used for agriculture, which demanded more draining of the lake until it was ultimately completely dry. The lake has subsequently reemerged with seasons of increased snowmelt since then. Most notably in 1906, a significant flood, which, when adjusted for today's dollars, would have been the most financially devastating natural disaster in California's history, as well as the 2023 flooding, which has brought widespread national attention to the region. Now that we've discussed the draining of Tulare Lake and its subsequent reflooding, let's move on to potential revitalization efforts for the lake. My next point of discussion today is going to be potential revitalization efforts for Tulare Lake. What to do about Tulare Lake has been a subject of conversation since before 1862. Back then, the main conversation was about water management. That still plays a major part in the conversation today, but now also factors subjects such as ecological restoration as well as tribal sovereignty. From the Bureau of Land Management website, the Atwell Island Restoration Project, or AIP, is located in the historic Tontache wetland basin and sand ridge on the southern edge of the historical Tulare Lake. The AIP began in 2000 and consists of 8,000 acres of restored native valley grassland, wetland, and alkali sink habitats on an area that has been farmed for the past century. The AIP represents a very small part of what was historically Tulare Lake. With the agriculture in the region, it would be very difficult to fully restore the lake to what it was prior to colonization. But it does show an example of what can be done. And there are many areas of the former Tulare Lake which have been farmed for the past century that are no longer used for farmland today. That could potentially be revisited as additional revitalization opportunities for the lake. The Tulare Lake has a rich history, and its current state, occupied primarily by agricultural operations, comprises a very small portion of its existence. My main points of discussion today were the history of Tulare Lake prior to colonization, draining and subsequent cycles of reflooding, as well as potential future revitalization efforts for the lake. Despite its relative obscurity today, Tulare Lake was once an expansive lake which was drained to serve a modern purpose, yet demands a continued place in the world today. In the century since Europeans arrived on this continent, we have spent much of this time reshaping the landscape to meet the demands of our society. With each reemergence, Tulare Lake reveals a stubborn refusal to be a forgotten piece of history. With these repeated natural revivals, Tulare Lake represents a rare opportunity of restoration into a world we once abandoned. Thank you.